see. But we are going to be talking about the CIA. This is so fascinating, interesting, and wild to me. Nothing new. I feel like I knew about MK Ultra. I've heard about these things when I was younger, but didn't really know in depth what it was about, what it was for. First, to start out, I'm just going to explain what MK Ultra is and why it was even created, and then we are going to get into the real life Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde of the CIA, this evil scientist that headed this program. So first, let's talk about why this even came about. Now, during the Cold War era, the CIA became convinced that communists had discovered a drug or a technique that could be used for mind control. In response, the CIA developed its own program called MK Ultra, which initially started off as Project Bluebird, then transformed into Project Artichoke, and then to MK Ultra. This apparently started in the 50s, and they say that it ended in the 60s. However, I believe MK Ultra never ended. I think it's still a program that's still very much alive today. It was too successful for it not to still be in operation. Let's just start out with the Dr. Jekyll guy, right? Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde guy. Sidney Gottlieb, he didn't seem to have the similar background as his co-workers, the other CIA recruits. He was actually really struggling before he got into the CIA, but before I even get to that point, let's go to his childhood, because this is actually really important, and we're gonna see later how it was really trippy and bizarre who he was working with, because he could have actually been a victim of his co-workers, I guess you could say. We'll get to that later. So he was born to Hungarian and Jewish parents. He was born on August 13th, 1918 in the Bronx. And as a child, he had a really bad stutter, and he was actually born with a club foot. But he had a real lifelong passion of folk dancing. Now, he was not an only child. He did have an older brother named David, who was a plant biologist. Sidney Gottlieb graduated high school, and then he went to the Free City College in New York, and after that he wanted to study agriculture. He wanted to attend University of Wisconsin, but before he could do that, he had to take classes in botany, organic chemistry, and principles of dairying, and to do that, he had to first attend Arkansas Tech University. So there, he went there. He did really, really well. So well that it actually gained him admission into the University of Wisconsin, where he was top of his class. He graduated magna cum laude. And then he was accepted into CIT, the California Institute of Technology. And when he was there, he was, he did amazing work as well. He got his doctorate in biochemistry, and while he was at CIT, he actually met his wife, Margaret. Now, when he graduated, he wanted to go into the military, but because of the clubfoot, they wouldn't accept him. So he was like, okay, well, what else can I do? Putting his degree to use, they moved outside of Washington near Vienna, Virginia. They were in a cabin, and they were really struggling. I mean, they had no running water, no electricity, and at this point they had 2 daughters. On July 13th, 1951 is when Sidney Gottlieb started his first day at the CIA. This is where he met Alan Dulles. So Alan Dulles actually later became the director of the CIA. things like, they call them like black sites, like Camp King. They would do special interrogation techniques where they would drug up captured prisoners on THC, heroin, cocaine, in order to get the truth out of them. However, it wasn't very effective, and it really lacked scientific knowledge and discipline, and this is where Sidney Gottlieb came in. Alan Dulles really wanted him to bring in his expertise to really, lead this project in the right way. So this meant a lot to these two men. It wasn't just some research project. Both Alan Dulles and Sidney Gottlieb believed that there was a way to influence and control the human mind, which could ultimately lead to global mastery. So what they were looking to create was, one, a truth serum, and two, an amnesiac. So they wanted to be able to extract information out of people very easily, but then also make them forget. And this is really important because with the mind control technique, they wanted to create people that would do things like sabotage or assassinations and make them forget who gave them the command, what they were working for, what they're working on. Like, they basically, if you were to question them, it would just seem like somebody who was unhinged. And there are so many cases like this, famous cases, and I'm going to talk about this later. So Sidney Gottlieb started to conduct his experiments. He decided, well, the CIA hasn't actually experimented with LSD. They haven't really looked into it. Now, LSD was relatively new. It was actually synthesized 13 years earlier in Switzerland by a Dr. Albert Hoffman. Now, let me talk about the effects of LSD for those who have no idea what this drug is or what it can do to you. I personally don't do this. Don't do drugs. Don't do this. I don't do drugs. It scares me. So LSD is synthetically made from lysergic acid, which is found in a fungus called ergot, which grows on rye and other grains. And the effects of this, it's that you begin to see, hear, and feel things that are not real, and it becomes increasingly difficult and basically impossible to distinguish reality from the hallucinations.
Everything, you have to see the air. You can't believe it. And the dimensions and all the prisms and the rays and everything coming down through you and moving.
What does this all mean to you?
I've never seen such infinite beauty in my life. It's like a curtain or a spider web. Can you see it? It's right here in front of me, right now. Watch. No. Oh, good heavens.
So this is what Dr. Sidney Gottlieb wanted to experiment with. What did this guy do? He didn't just buy a little bit just to test it. No. He spent $240,000 to buy the world's supply of LSD. And they started to give it out to mental institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, because this is where they were going to do a lot of tests on people who had no idea that they were being used as test subjects. Sidney Gottlieb's first 18 months were really frustrating for him. The truth serums, they just weren't working. And at the time, President Eisenhower came into power, and as I said, Alan Dulles became the director of the CIA, and his brother actually was a Secretary of State. His brother is John Foster Dulles, and they basically gave Sidney Gottlieb a free rein to do whatever he needed to do to make this project successful. Sidney Gottlieb had nobody looking over his shoulder. He had no one to answer to. He was quite literally a mad scientist on the loose that was about to wreak havoc cases of women who came to this institute dealing with postpartum depression. They already had their kids. They were just really low on energy, just really depressed, and they got to the point when they really needed help. And Val, in particular, says that when she got there, you know, she heard the talkings of this Dr. Cameron, this amazing Dr. Cameron, who's world-renowned, who's going to help her. Now, Dr. Cameron was one of the psychiatrists who was definitely in on the MK Ultra program who worked at the CIA. Basically, what happened is he would sit down with these women and he would look at them, take a look at them, ask them a few questions, get to find out what's going on, and then he would start treatment. So let's start with Val first. Val came in for postpartum depression. The people would talk about this Dr. Cameron, like see him, and he would walk through the halls like a giant, and he was someone that they feared, but that they respected and felt and believed that he could really help them. Val really said, I'm gonna do everything he says. I really want to do a great job. I really want to come out of here healed and ready to go back to my family, and this is the man who's going to help me. And she literally said that there was not one appointment, starting from the first to the last time that she saw him, that she would not literally shake with fear. This man, Dr. Cameron, was described as someone who was ruthless, who was incredibly serious, who was power hungry, who was anxious and very tense, and he just was not a nice person at all. I guess when you think about those old movies that are based in mental health hospitals and that mean doctor, this is Dr. Cameron, okay? There was no comfort coming from him. So basically, what would happen is Val went to the room for her first treatment, and she looked at this tray and she saw lysergic acid. She said, So she called up her friend who was in this field, psychiatric field, and everything, to get some advice. And the friend told her, this is a poison, don't do it. It's very dangerous and it causes a poisonous psychosis. But she said, you know what, this friend actually doesn't even believe in drugs of any kind, more of like a naturalist. This is a world-renowned doctor, Dr. Cameron. I'm just going to trust the process and go along with this. I'm already here. And so she let him inject her with the first round of LSD. Now, in total, she got about 14 rounds of LSD in her. But it would happen where sometimes it would be one day after another consecutive like this, or there would be 4 days in between each dose. This was a terrifying experience for her. She just remembered like looking out the window and seeing a squirrel and thinking, you're not the squirrel, I'm the squirrel. I'm stuck in here. I'm in this cage. And there would be like, she would just be out of her mind, seeing things, feeling things. And under the pillow, which was the technique, the mind control technique when they were trying to erase the human psyche, is that they would play recordings under the pillow. So this happened to her over and over again, and there would be times that she's like, Dr. Cameron, I don't want to do this, and she's shaking with fear. She's still scared, but this was just horrifying and terrifying for her, and you feel so bad after. And he would always call the woman Lassie, which, anyways, he would say, oh Lassie, you'll do it again. When she said that, I didn't want to do it, and she said okay, fine, because she didn't want to tell him no. I mean, he was an intimidating guy. And she remembers that she was scheduled to do another treatment, and she was literally in her bathroom hiding like a child from the doctor because she heard him coming, and she told him, like, I cannot do this anymore. For her, it felt like her bones were melting. She couldn't write. She used to write letters all the time. She used to read. She couldn't even hold the pen to write. She couldn't focus. This was really messing her up in a really bad way, and she got to her limit, and she said, I can't do this anymore. And days was really bad. Janine's, came in, he saw her doctor, asked her some questions, and then literally sent her up to the sleep room. It's called the sleep room because they put you to sleep. He literally had her. Now listen, Janine had, 5 kids, I believe. She had, 5 kids, I think 2 twins in the family. Took her up to the sleep room, put her in a coma for 86 days. And during these 86 days, she's hearing this recording, something like, why don't you want to take care of your responsibilities, in like a loop over each other, overlapping. I mean, it was basically just trying to really wipe her mind of what it was and put in something new. And there would be electroshock treatments. And she woke up after the 86 days, and she was shown like a picture book of her family, and she knew that she had kids, but she had no idea. Like she knew that like she gave birth, but she had no idea really who her kids were. She forgot them. She couldn't remember anything of the past. This doctor, in order to get her up to the sleep room, he gave her a fake diagnosis of acute schizophrenia. When she was able to get up and walk around, she actually had to learn how to walk. She had to learn how to go to the bathroom again, literally like a child, all over again. Now the scary thing about this is that, well, 2 things. Number 1, people were forced to pay for this. So you literally come in for your postpartum depression. There's a certain, a treatment plan typically that you pay for. But instead, they are literally lied to about their diagnosis. They are drugged up, electroshocked, and forced to pay for this treatment. And it was not cheap. And because these patients were staying there for an extended period of time, sometimes they would get like passes to go home, maybe for the weekend or for a few days, but they had to come back. When they would go home, they would be like, I don't want to go back to the institute. Like, I don't need to be drugged up. I don't need to be electroshocked. I don't need to be doing this. This is really making me worse than I was. What is this for? Like, it didn't make any sense. And they were told by the clinic, if you don't come back, we will call the police to come and get you. And that scared them and intimidated them into coming back. There was a guy named Robert who went into that institute at 18 years old. He was experiencing trembling and leg pains. They drugged him up with LSD about 12 to 15 times. And while doing this, the doctor kept telling him, you're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And he felt like he was getting smaller and smaller to the point, and they would actually like do things to like bring him back in time to the point where he felt like he was being born, and he felt absolutely no control. And under the pillow, while you're drugged up, seeing things, whatever, you're listening to these overlapping recordings over and over again. They would literally play these recordings 250,000 times. It would drive a person insane. And it actually did. There was a young guy who was like not even 30 years old. He was at the clinic under this experiment, and he literally, like, I think he came out of his room and said, okay, goodbye everybody, I wish you well, something like this. And he jumped out of his window into the courtyard. And after that happened, I mean, he did it in direct relation to the torture that he was experiencing under this MK Ultra program. And after that happened, like, nobody went into that courtyard for a long time, and they, like, nobody even talked about it, or, like, it was almost like it didn't happen because it was just that traumatizing. There was, I think it was Val who said that there was a woman who was very lively, very spirited, that she would see all the time. She was another one who was a victim of this MK Ultra program in this clinic. And she asked one day, oh, where is this lady? And they were like, oh, she's right there by the TV. And she saw this middle-aged woman sitting there like a vegetable in a chair in front of the television, personality completely gone. young, I believe he was Mexican, guy who worked in the hotel kitchen, and he stopped RFK for a brief second just to shake his hand and say how happy he was to meet him. And at this moment, RFK gets shot. Now he gets shot from behind, but Saren is in front of him. So how does that happen? Thing is, well, Jesus, this is a lot. So they think that Saren is the one who pulled the trigger. So there are men that see this guy with the gun and try to stop him. Now Saren seemed to have extraordinary human strength, like 3 men. One of them I think was a football player, muscle dude, strong, and could not get this gun out of his hand. Now RFK, he actually turned around and he grabbed the man's tie. This is the man who actually shot RFK from behind. And he didn't die immediately. He fell to the ground and he was holding this guy's tie in his hand. And the young guy who stopped him for a second just to shake his hand got down on his knees, put the rosary in his hand, and that's when RFK's wife came over and everything. But here's Saren in front, and still these guys are struggling with him. Bend him over a table backwards, still can't get this gun out of this guy's hand. Gun goes off a few times and shoots, and I think it shoots other people, but nobody died. And the guy who actually, basically, the guy who actually shot RFK was a part of the CIA, and he, got a position at that hotel the day before RFK was slated to be there, or scheduled to be there. Suspicious. That's not a coincidence. And literally the day after, this guy moved out to the Philippines, which is where he stayed away. Anyway, Saren is the fall guy, and he goes to jail for this. He gets convicted, but over the course of how many years now, this man still doesn't remember anything about that. He doesn't know why he would ever want to do that. What's the motivation? And even RFK Jr. believes that Saren did not do this to his father. He was literally someone a part of the MK Ultra program, a fall guy, and the guy who actually did it, he was actually going to meet him in the Philippines, but this guy was like shifty and whatever. But this is an example of the MK Ultra program because, like I said, it was used for assassinations as well. There was actually something legitimately called Operation Midnight Climax. It's ridiculous. It said that Operation Midnight Climax was established in order to see the effects of LSD on unknowing subjects, people who had no idea what was going on. They were non-consenting. So, the women of the night who were on the CIA payroll would lure clients back to the safe houses, these really secure safe houses that were based in New York and San Francisco. They were piled with a range of different substances, including LSD, and they were monitored behind one-way glass. The women of the night, I don't know if I could say prostitutes, I guess I could say that, they were instructed to use questioning in order to investigate whether the Johns could be convinced to divulge secrets involuntarily. The victims were sometimes fed subliminal messages in attempts to induce involuntary actions, including criminal activities such as robberies, assault, and even assassinations. And the most disgusting and disturbing part about this, I mean, this is all disgusting and disturbing, but even the CIA agents themselves would take part in using LSD and hooking up with the prostitutes. I mean, it was just disgusting all around. So we kind of covered what MK Ultra is. So we're going to talk about how it got exposed, and in order to do that, we have to bring up Frank Olson. Frank Olson was Well, he actually became a top MK Ultra scientist, but before he joined the CIA, basically what he would do is develop a range of lethal aerosols, which would be in hand-sized containers like shaving creams, insect repellents, and he would also use anthrax. Another weapon that he was working on was a cigarette lighter, which gave out an almost immediate lethal dose of gas, a lipstick that would kill on contact, and a neat pocket spray for asthma sufferers that induced pneumonia. Frank Olson then got tuned into the MK Ultra program with Sidney Gottlieb and the experiments on how much LSD would it take to shatter the human mind and blast away consciousness, leaving a total void in which you could implant new programs and even a new personality. Frank Olson worked with animals, and it involved him gassing and poisoning animals, and it actually really got to him because he would literally come into his lab and see piles of like dead monkeys, and he didn't really want to do it anymore. He also started to see torture on humans, and that stuff really messed with him. I think it really does take a special kind of person to look at an animal or a human suffer and feel nothing and just continue on with the plan. Whereas with Frank Olson, it seems that yes, he was doing these experiments, but when he started to see like the piles of dead animals and the actual torture, like witnessing that directly, it did something to him. He would also travel to Germany and he would witness what you would call like expendable tortures. Expendables was the name given to people who were suspected to be moles, spies, or security leaks, and they were literally tortured to death in like experimental methods, which involved being drugged up, hypnotized, tortured. So this is the point that really changed Frank Olson's journey, and this is the beginning of what exposed the MK Ultra program. As Thanksgiving was coming up in 1953, Frank Olson was invited to a cabin with about 4 different CIA scientists, which included Sidney Gottlieb, technical service staff, and 5 Army scientists. Now, it seems like different moving parts, but they worked so closely together. They were a small team, so it made sense for them to come together anyway, because they would discuss what projects they were working on and exchange ideas in a more relaxed environment at this cabin. This was on Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. And while there, they had dinner, and like I said, it was a relaxed environment. Nobody suspected anything. And at one point, they began to serve drinks. Now these people are smart enough to know that you might not want to drink anything that the CIA gives you, because before, when they were doing experiments, they would lace Kool-Aid with LSD. But anyways, so they were served a round of drinks, and it made everybody a little bit more comfortable. And at one point, Sidney Gottlieb, he said, "Hey, does anybody feel a little bit strange? If you do, it's because I spiked your drinks with LSD." They were angry, understandably. Like, is this a trick? Like, what are you trying to do? And for Frank Olson, it became like the conversations, they no longer made any sense. He was having difficulty differentiating reality from a delusion, and basically this meeting did not end in any serious way, as you can imagine. So 4 days after, they had already left the cabin, and Frank Olson was going back to work, and he was there with his boss early in the morning. And this night really affected him. It did something to him that he couldn't come back from. And Frank's boss literally called that experience one of the most frightening experiences that he's ever had, being dosed up with LSD, which is quite funny when you are the one who is partly responsible for dosing up so many people all over with LSD, torturing them. And then when just some dose of LSD happens to you, minus a torture, it's the most frightening experience. You can't take it. Which actually, in one of the psych wards, words somebody wrote to, I believe it was Dr. Cameron, and to the staff saying who was responsible for giving us these LSD doses and treating us like this. Any of you guys, I propose that you, give over your own head, give over your own mind to be drugged up with LSD and tortured and electroshocked. Why don't you try it for yourself? It's a different experience when it's you that's drugged up and on this type of stuff. And yeah, it really affected quite a few people. Now, Frank Olson was the one out of a few men that night that was starting to go a bit rogue. Now, these men had such a fear in them because of the gravity of the situation of what they were doing and the secrecy that they needed to have. And they knew that if they threatened or if they got scared or freaked out, that they didn't want to be a part of this anymore. It was their lives on the line. Now, Frank Olson, when he was with his boss, he literally said, like, listen, I can quit, or you can fire me. Like, he was scared, he didn't want to do this anymore. But his boss convinced him, like, just calm down, buddy. Just stay on the job. It's gonna be okay. I mean, we're all a bit freaked out, but don't do anything crazy. Don't, go off the plan here. Keep it together. And like I said, this was no light situation. The MK Ultra program was a very deep, deep secret, and the success or failure of MK Ultra to these men might determine the fate of the United States and all of humanity. So this put the fear of God in these men. Frank Olson knew way too much, right? He was a risk. He was in Germany, like I said, he witnessed a lot of interrogations. Frank Olson was actually in France at this time when there was a village not far from Avignon, if you guys have visited, called Pont Saint-Esprit. So in this village there was basically this case of like mass hysteria and delirium, and 200 people got sick and a few died, and it was actually connected to the ergot, which was the fungus that LSD is derived from. Frank Olson just simply, he was too into it, he knew too much, but he was also the kind of person who was very open and not afraid to say what he thought. He didn't really hold back, and this made people a bit nervous. So, Frank Olson, like I said, he was convinced by his boss just to stay and, told that he was doing really good work and just to continue. In the spring of 1953, he went down to Wiltshire. There he saw this experiment that was happening. There was a volunteer subject. He was a 20-year-old soldier, and he was dosed with sarin. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. This drug. And he began to foam at the mouth. He collapsed. He was in like convulsions, and he actually died an hour later. And this really shook Frank Olson up, and he spoke about his discomfort seeing this with the psychiatrist. So a month later he went to Germany and went to the safe houses, and he saw these men that were there, and he just felt again deep discomfort over seeing men die over things that he helped to create. And he expressed not wanting to keep this a secret anymore. It just caused such inner turmoil was expecting him to be back home for Thanksgiving. However, apparently, this is what they say in the car ride back towards the airport to fly to Washington, Frank Olson was distressed, and he told his colleague that, listen, I don't really want to see my family like this. I feel ashamed all the work that I've done and seeing how it's destroyed people. I just can't seem to face my family. Like, can you just drop me off on the side of the street? Like, I will just walk and go off on my own. And his coworker was like, no, we can't do that. And he said, well, fine, just turn me into the police because they are looking for me anyway. And they're like, you know what, why don't we just go back to see Harold, and how would you feel about that? And he said, okay, that's fine. So they turned back, went back to New York, and saw Harold again, and apparently he discussed with Frank that he should voluntarily go to the Maryland sanatorium and stay there for a little bit. And apparently Frank agreed and expressed, like, looking forward to going to this place. Personally, I don't really believe this story, but this is what they say happened. And it was strange because after that meeting, Frank Olson and his colleague went to this Manhattan hotel, and Frank washed his socks in the sink, sat down to watch some TV on the bed, and apparently at 2 a.m. in the morning, this guy jumped out of his window, and the, how do you call it, like the security at the hotel, standing by the door, saw Frank Olson fall to the ground, and he yelled for some help, like, we have a jumper, we got a jumper. And Frank Olson died. Now, this is where the CIA cleanup comes in. This was quite an operation because there are about 30 steps that they had to take. First of all, they persuaded the New York Police Department, the NYPD, to not investigate what happened here. And to convince them didn't take much, to just go along with a story to be planted in the media as to what happened. Mislead the press, basically. Second thing, you had to create a career, a fake career for this guy who was with Frank Olson, for his CIA colleague, because it couldn't be found out that the CIA had anything to do with this. They were a part of the CIA. It just couldn't be traced back. And then the third thing that they had to do was inform Frank Olson's family and make sure that they were convinced of this story of what happened, and went along with this and accepted the sad, unexpected, untimely death of their loved one. So Alice is Frank Olson's wife, and she was at home and she was informed about what happened. It obviously was devastating. They planned a funeral. It was a closed casket, and the official narrative was just that Frank Olson did this to himself, and he jumped off and did this to himself, and he was buried. And you would think that the CIA would kind of pull back on their mind-altering drug treatments, especially seeing how it affected Frank Olson, how he never came back from that. And but it didn't deter them. They went right along with this. And then that Frank Olson was buried, it just seemed that their secret was buried along with them and that they could just move on. However, there was a whistleblower of sort in 1975, and I believe it was on the New York Post or the Washington Post, that made a story that there is this guy in the CIA that jumped out of a window who had been drugged up with LSD by the CIA and reacted so badly that he jumped out of this window. And after this reporting came out, the CIA was like hit with a lot of reporters wanting to ask questions and figure out what this was about. It just created such a huge buzz. And Frank Olson's family, they called a press conference because now they're going to have more information. Like, wait a second, what happened? Because it made sense to Alice. She said, my husband never seemed off in any way. He actually seemed very calm and very sure about his decision of wanting to leave his job with the CIA. So to hear this, it starts to piece together that maybe my husband did not do this to himself. As a consequence, Frank's family asked the NYPD happened in July 1975 when the Frank Olson family came to the White House. They actually met with the CIA director at the time. It was William Colby. He apologized for what was called a terrible thing that should have never happened. And apparently the White House lawyers offered Frank Olson's family about $750,000 in exchange for dropping the legal claims. So Congress passed a bill apparently that approved this payment, and they just wanted everything to quietly go away and for things to continue happening in secret. Now, at Frank Olson's funeral, guess who was there? Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, this guy, Sidney Gottlieb. So Sidney Gottlieb was there, and he talked to Frank Olson's family, and he offered them reassurance and said, hey, listen, if you ever have any questions, or you want to know like what happened or anything, if I could be of any support to you, just let me know. So they actually took him up on that offer. So here comes Alice, Frank's wife, and his adult children are walking out of store one day, and Sidney Gottlieb lets them in. He actually greeted them by saying, oh, I'm so happy you don't have a weapon. I had a dream last night that you showed up at my door and shot me. This was a manipulation tactic. It got the family of Frank Olson apologizing to Sidney and disarming the situation and reassuring him that everything was okay. It was a very well executed manipulation tactic on Sidney Gottlieb's part. So he actually told him the story of what happened at the Deep Creek Lake in Maryland, and how everybody was like given a dose of LSD in their drinks just to see as an experiment what would happen if a scientist was taken as a prisoner and drugged. Would they divulge secret information? Now I'm gonna read this part because it says that as the family was getting ready to leave, Sidney Gottlieb actually pulled Eric, Frank's son, aside, and he said, you are obviously very troubled by your father's passing. Have you ever considered